The gun was already pressed against Emmett Alden's temple when Rebecca Ford looked him dead in the eye and said, "You lied to me." The saloon had gone so quiet that the only sound was the creak of the floorboard under her boots and the distant howl of wind against the shuttered windows of Caldwell, Kansas. The year was 1882, late September, and the last stage west had brought many things to this town before: desperate men, broken women, dreams wrapped in saddlebags, but it had never brought anything quite like her. Emmett did not flinch. That was the thing about him that had undone her from the very beginning. Even now, with cold iron against his skull and half the town watching through the saloon's cracked window, his jaw was set like granite and his gray eyes were fixed entirely on her. "I didn't lie," he said, low and steady. "I withheld. There's a difference." "Not to me there isn't." Rebecca's voice did not shake. It never shook. That was what 3 years tracking her father's enemies across 6 territories had taught her. That fear was a luxury she could not afford. The man holding the gun to Emmett's head was named Cutter Voss, and he was not the kind of man who needed a reason to pull a trigger. He had ridden with her father, Calvin Ford, for 8 years before Calvin had made the mistake of trusting him. Voss had been the one who turned on him. Voss had been the one who had ridden into Caldwell 6 months before Rebecca arrived, quietly, carefully, like a worm burrowing into the root of something good. He had whispered the right things into the right ears. He had made himself indispensable to a town that did not yet know what indispensable could cost. And Emmett Alden, the sheriff of Caldwell, a man Rebecca had been certain was an enemy and had slowly, terrifyingly come to love, had known Voss was here, had known it before she arrived on that stage, and had not told her. Which meant either he had been protecting her or he had been using her as bait. The question of which one it was felt like the difference between everything and nothing. "Rebecca," Emmett said, and the way he said her name with that quiet weight, like it meant something he had no right to claim, cracked something in her chest. "Put the rifle down." She had not even realized she had raised it. Her Winchester was leveled at Voss from across the room, the barrel perfectly steady, because her hands did not shake any more than her voice did. "You've got about 4 seconds," she said, "before I put a round through Voss's shoulder, and you use the next 3 to get yourself clear. Or you can keep talking, and we can sort through who lied to whom while the whole situation gets considerably worse." That was when Emmett almost smiled. Even now, even here. And that was the moment Rebecca would later understand that she knew she was utterly lost. But to explain how they had arrived here in this saloon, in this standoff, in this impossible, aching thing between them, you had to go back to the night the last stage west rolled into Caldwell. It had been the 14th of June, 1882, a Thursday, and the summer heat was sitting on the Kansas plains like something personally offended by the existence of human beings. The stage from Wichita arrived 40 minutes late, which was early by Caldwell standards, and Emmett Alden was not waiting at the depot because he made a habit of it. He was there because he had received a wire. The wire had come from a marshal in Dodge City, a man named Harding who owed Emmett a favor from the previous winter when Emmett had quietly buried evidence that would have embarrassed the marshal's office in a way that would have been better for nobody. The wire said 3 words that Emmett had been waiting 7 months to receive. "She is coming." He had read it twice, folded it, and put it in his breast pocket next to his badge, and then he had walked to the depot and stood with his arms crossed and his hat low and waited for the stage. He had not known what to expect. He had heard stories about Calvin Ford's daughter the same way most lawmen west of Missouri had, in fragments, in rumors, in the uncomfortable silence that fell over a room when her name came up. She had not been an outlaw herself, not technically. But she had been raised on the run, educated in camps and safe houses across 4 territories, and by the time she was grown she was, by most accounts, something the frontier had not quite seen before. He had expected someone hard, someone brittle with survival. He had not expected Rebecca Ford. The stage door swung open and she stepped down without assistance, which was the first thing he noticed. She was 26 years old, with dark hair pinned practically under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen considerable weather, wearing a traveling coat the color of dry earth and boots that were broken in the right way. The way that meant they had actually been broken by miles, not by affectation. She carried a single leather satchel and a Winchester rifle that she held with the casual ease of someone who had been carrying it, since she was old enough to manage the weight. She looked at the town first, then at the horizon, then at him, not in a slow, cautious way, but in 3 quick, efficient assessments, and he had the unsettling sense that she had already made 3 separate decisions by the time her eyes settled on him. "You're the sheriff," she said, not a question. "Emmett Alden." He did not extend his hand. Something about her bearing made the gesture feel presumptuous. "And you're Rebecca Ford." Was there ever a doubt? She tilted her head slightly, and there was nothing coy about it. It was purely measuring. "You knew I was coming. I was informed you might. By Harding." She let the name sit flat between them, not as an accusation and not as anything else. Just a fact placed where it could be seen. He said nothing, because denying it would have been insulting and confirming it would have given her information he had not yet decided she'd earned. She almost smiled. It was barely a thing, a slight shift at the corner of her mouth, but it was genuine, and it startled him. "Fair enough," she said. "Then let me tell you what I told Harding so we don't waste each other's time. I'm not here as a criminal. I'm not here to cause trouble for your town. I'm here because a man who wronged my family is here, and I intend to prove it before a court and see him properly dealt with. I'm not looking for frontier justice. I'm looking for legal remedy." She paused. "Which is, I imagine, what a sheriff is supposed to want." Emmett studied her for a long moment. "Your father was Calvin Ford." "My father was Calvin Ford." Her voice did not flinch from the past tense. She had clearly said it before. Calvin Ford had died 8 months ago in a federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas, serving a sentence for armed robbery and possession of stolen federal currency. He had been 61 years old. What the official record did not include, what Emmett knew from Harding's file and his own investigation, was that Calvin Ford had not actually committed the federal currency crime. He had been set up for it by Cutter Voss, who had wanted Calvin out of the way so he could take control of a criminal network that Calvin had spent 20 years building. The robbery and the stolen bills had been Voss's operation, and he had arranged the evidence to point to Calvin with a precision that suggested either considerable intelligence or considerable help. The result was that Calvin Ford, who had been a genuine outlaw by any fair assessment and had committed plenty of real crimes in his time, had died in a cell for one he hadn't done, and Voss had walked free and come to Caldwell and started over under a different life. "He told you," Emmett said. "He told me in his last letter," Rebecca confirmed. "Wrote me everything he knew, the names, the dates, the location where Voss stashed the evidence he'd used to frame him. If that evidence still exists, it proves the setup. It also proves Voss's connection to 3 other crimes this territory would very much like solved. And you think the evidence still exists?" "I know it exists," she said, with a certainty that was not bravado, "because I know where it is." That was when Emmett understood he had a problem. Not the kind of problem that a man solves by reaching for his gun, but the infinitely more complicated kind. The kind where a woman arrives in your town carrying information that could unravel something you have been carefully, quietly building toward for the better part of a year. And she arrives with those dark eyes and that steady voice and that Winchester held like a natural extension of her body. And you realize that the plan you've been working on alone was always going to need someone exactly like her. He said the thing that he would later understand had set everything in motion. "You can have one night," he said. "One night to show me what you have. After that, we decide together whether you stay." She had looked at him for a long moment with those considering eyes. "One night," she repeated. "That's what I said." "All right, Sheriff, one night." She had not known, could not have known what he meant by it. Not the weight of it, not the truth of it, not the fact that he'd been working toward this moment for months, and that what she was carrying in that satchel and in her father's letter might be exactly what he needed to finish what he'd started. He had meant it as a professional offer. He had not understood yet that he had just made a promise that would turn out to be considerably more permanent than one night. He took her to the office first, because that was where the lamp was good and where the desk was large enough to spread things out. It was a single room at the front of the jailhouse with a connecting door to the two holding cells in the back, and the cells were empty that night because Caldwell was, on the surface, a reasonably quiet town. Voss had been careful about that. The deputy, a young man named Tobias who was 20 years old and sincerely well-meaning, was sent home. Emmett locked the front door. Rebecca set her satchel on the desk and opened it without ceremony. The contents were extraordinary. She had organized everything the way an attorney would chronologically, cross-referenced, with notations in her own hand that connected each piece of evidence to the next in a chain that was both elegant and devastatingly clear. There were letters in Calvin Ford's handwriting, letters from informants whose names Emmett recognized, a hand-drawn map of a property outside of Caldwell where Voss had supposedly stored the physical evidence, 3 newspaper clippings from Dodge City that, taken together, placed Voss at the scene of the original robbery on a date he had claimed to be elsewhere, and a sworn affidavit from a dying man in Abilene who had witnessed Voss planting the currency on Calvin Ford's property. Emmett read through everything without speaking. It took him over an hour. Rebecca did not fidget or rush him. She sat in the chair across from him with her arms rested on her knees and her hat on the desk beside her, and she let him work through it at his own pace. When he finally looked up, she was watching him with an expression he could not entirely read. "This is," he said, and then stopped. "Thorough," she offered. "I was going to say extraordinary." He set down the last page. "You put this together yourself." "My father sent me the framework. I spent 6 months filling in everything else. I learned to read records from a retired circuit judge who wintered near my aunt's property in Colorado. I learned to track documentary evidence from a woman in Denver who ran the records office for the Arapahoe County Court. She said it plainly, without pride, the way she might report on the weather. I'm not a lawyer, but I understand what lawyers need." Emmett leaned back in his chair and looked at her across the lamplight. There was something happening in his chest that he did not have an immediate name for. He had met competent people. He had met intelligent people. He had met people who were capable in a crisis. But what Rebecca Ford had assembled in that satchel represented a kind of sustained, methodical, clear-headed work that he found genuinely startling, and the frankness with which she described how she'd acquired each skill without performance, without waiting to be told she was impressive, undid something in him. "The evidence Voss stored," he said carefully. "The physical evidence your father's letter told you about. Have you actually seen it?" "Not yet. But I know what it is and I know where it is." She reached into the satchel and produced a second envelope, smaller, sealed. "My father's letter included specific instructions. He had a way of hiding things that I recognized, a code we developed when I was young, when we traveled and communication had to be careful. The location is a farm property 4 miles east of town. It was purchased under a different name 6 years ago, but the land records in Wichita show the real owner, Voss, under the name Thomas Carver, which is the alias he used before he came to Caldwell as himself." She set the envelope on the desk. "The physical evidence is in a storm cellar on that property. Specific spot, specific container. I would need to retrieve it to verify it's still there." Emmett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been building a case against Voss for 7 months. Rebecca's eyes sharpened slightly, but she did not look surprised. "I wondered," she said. "The wire from Harding, the fact that you were at the depot and knew my name. You've been waiting for something." "I've been waiting for the right piece," he said. "The thing that connects what I know about what Voss has been doing here to what he did before. Without that connection, I have a pattern of suspicious behavior and no way to tie it to anything a court would act on." He paused. "What you have might be the connection." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then we have a problem," she said quietly. "Do we?" You gave me one night. And in one night, we have to figure out whether we trust each other enough to do this together. Because if we don't, we'll get in each other's way and Voss will notice, and whatever window exists for doing this cleanly will close. She was entirely right. He knew it the moment she said it, and the fact that she had gotten there ahead of him, had already thought through the strategic implication of the situation, while he was still reading her evidence, was startling in the best possible way. Then we trust each other, he said, just like that. Not just like that, he said. But I've read what you've assembled, and I know what it means, and I know what it cost you to put it together. That tells me something about who you are. She was quiet for a moment. The lamplight caught the line of her jaw, and outside the jailhouse the town had gone to sleep, and for a moment it was just the two of them across that desk with everything they each carried spread out in the open between them. My father was not a good man, she said softly, not with bitterness but with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been honest about a hard truth for a long time. I want to be clear about that. He did real harm and I don't excuse it. But he didn't do this crime and he died for it. That matters. It matters, Emmett agreed. She looked at him and something shifted in her expression, something small, barely perceptible, but he caught it. A degree of tension releasing. The first indication that being in this room with him felt to her like something other than another calculated risk. He felt it too. He pretended not to because that was probably wise. They worked through the rest of the night, both of them bent over the desk in the lamplight, mapping what he had against what she had, finding the places where the two investigations overlapped and reinforced each other. By 3 in the morning, there was coffee from the pot he kept on the small iron stove in the corner, and the plan was taking shape. They would need to retrieve the physical evidence from the storm cellar without alerting Voss. They would need a federal marshal present when they did it, to ensure proper chain of custody. And they would need to move carefully, because Voss had built himself a comfortable position in Caldwell. He had ingratiated himself with the mayor, with the owner of the largest cattle operation in the county, and with at least 2 members of the town council, which meant that moving against him openly would trigger defensive alliances before they were ready. He can't know I'm here in connection with this, Rebecca said. If he knows who I am and why I'm here, he'll run, or worse. He'll find out you're here, Emmett said. News travels in a town this size. Then I need a reason to be here that isn't the real reason. She thought for a moment. Do you have a school? Emmett blinked. We have a schoolhouse. The teacher left in March. Rebecca looked at him steadily. Then I need a job. She became the school teacher of Caldwell, Kansas, on the 15th of June, 1882, which was the following morning, and she walked into that position with the same efficient confidence she brought to everything else. Emmett arranged it with a quiet word to the town school board chairman, a decent widower named Hargrove, who was so relieved to solve the teacher problem that he did not ask many questions. And by the afternoon Rebecca had met the 12 children who comprised Caldwell's student body and had taken stock of what they knew, what they didn't, and what they needed. She was, as it turned out, a remarkable teacher. This was not something Emmett had anticipated, though in retrospect he could not have said why. She had a way of explaining things, mathematics, grammar, the history of the territories, that assumed intelligence in the children without condescending to it, and the children responded to being taken seriously in a way that was immediate and evident. Within a week, attendance had improved by 4 children who had previously been considered unteachable, including a boy of 9 who turned out to have a genuinely exceptional aptitude for arithmetic that had gone completely unnoticed because his previous teacher had written him off. Emmett found out about this from Deputy Tobias, who mentioned it with the unself-conscious admiration of a young man who had no idea he was reporting something significant. He also found out that Cutter Voss had visited the schoolhouse on her 3rd day. He had introduced himself as Thomas Carver, the alias, and presented himself as one of the town's respectable citizens with an interest in education. He had been, according to the account Rebecca gave Emmett afterward, in a very quiet, very controlled conversation at the back of the jailhouse, charming, well-groomed, and completely unaware that she had known his real identity since before she stepped off the stage. "He looked at me," she said, "the way men look at women they think they can understand at a glance. He made his assessment and it was wrong, and he is very comfortable with it being wrong, which is useful. He didn't recognize you. I was 12 years old the last time Voss was near my family. I look nothing like I did at 12. She paused. "And he has no reason to expect me. Nobody has told him I exist as far as I can determine." "That could change," Emmett said. "If he has contacts who knew your father's family." "I know," she said. "We need to move before it changes." The plan required a wire to a federal marshal. Emmett sent it through a contact in Topeka he trusted, a man named Beaumont who was careful and whose jurisdiction technically overlapped with Caldwell. Beaumont replied within 48 hours and said he could be there in 2 weeks. 2 weeks was both a long time and no time at all. In those 2 weeks, a number of things happened that Emmett had not planned for. The first was that Rebecca became part of the town in a way that was both practical and unexpectedly deep. She was invited to Sunday dinner at the Hargrove household. She was consulted by the woman who ran the dry goods store about a shipment discrepancy that turned out to involve some creative accounting on the part of the supplier, which Rebecca identified by reviewing the store's records in a single afternoon, and which saved the store owner a considerable sum of money. She helped a young Mexican mother whose landlord was threatening eviction without legal basis by drafting a response letter that cited the relevant territorial statutes with enough precision to make the landlord back down immediately. The town, in short, took to her. And she took to the town, which surprised her. Emmett could see it in the brief moments of unguarded expression that appeared on her face when she thought nobody was watching. She had expected to be here for a purpose and then leave. She had not expected to find a place that fit her. The second thing that happened was Emmett and Rebecca began to meet regularly, officially under the pretext of town safety meetings that he had instituted as a cover, but which became something else by degrees. They met in the evenings, 2 or 3 times a week, at the jailhouse, and they talked about the case, always about the case at first. But the conversations did not stay contained to it. She told him about growing up with Calvin Ford, about the camps, the constant movement, the education assembled from pieces books found in saddlebags, tutors who stayed a season, her father's own considerable and entirely self-taught intelligence, which he had passed on to her before he had also passed on the burden of his choices. She did not romanticize it. She was clear-eyed about the harm and the cost. But she also spoke of her father with a complex love that was honest in its complexity, and Emmett found himself deeply moved by it. He told her things in return that he had not told anyone in Caldwell. About his previous posting in Abilene, which had ended badly, a situation in which he had trusted the wrong person and people had been hurt, and the weight of that trust misplaced had settled on him in a way that had made Caldwell feel like both a fresh start and a self-imposed penance. About his parents, who had been school teachers in Ohio before they died of fever when he was 19, and about how he had come west looking for something he could not entirely name and had found a tin star instead, which was not nothing but was not quite everything either. What would everything look like? Rebecca asked him once quietly on a Tuesday evening when the lamp was low and the summer crickets were loud outside. He looked at her for a moment. The question felt very large. "Something permanent," he said at last. "Something that stays." She held his gaze. "I've never had that," she said, not with self-pity, just as information. "I know," he said. It was the kind of conversation that should have alarmed them both and instead felt like the most honest thing either of them had said in years. The third thing that happened in those 2 weeks was the shooting contest. It was held on the second Saturday, organized by the cattle operation owner as a summer event, open to anyone in town. There was prize money, there was considerable social interest, and approximately half the adult male population of Caldwell entered, including Emmett. Rebecca did not intend to enter. She had no strategic reason to draw attention to her marksmanship, which was, by any objective assessment, extraordinary. She had been shooting since she was 8 years old, had been trained partly by her father and partly by a woman sharpshooter who had wintered with Calvin's outfit in Colorado when Rebecca was 14, and she could place a round with a precision that was not reflexive luck, but the product of genuine technical understanding, breath control, trigger discipline. Reading wind and distance with the kind of mathematical clarity that the retired judge in Denver had told her was the same cognitive process as legal reasoning, applied to ballistics. She had been intending to watch from the edge of the crowd and remain unremarkable. What happened instead was that one of the older men in the competition made a comment, loud enough to carry, about women having no business near a rifle range, directed at no one in particular, but positioned directly at Rebecca, who was standing 12 feet away holding a glass of lemonade that Mrs. Hargrove had pressed on her. She looked at the man. She looked at the contest setup, a series of targets at distances ranging from 30 yards to 150. She looked at Emmett, who was standing near the line with the easy posture of a man who had no idea what was about to happen and who met her eyes with an expression of mild inquiry. She handed Mrs. Hargrove her glass. She signed up. The crowd reacted the way crowds did, which is to say with a mixture of amusement, skepticism, and the particular social anticipation of watching someone embarrass themselves. The man who had made the comment smiled in a way that suggested he considered the point already made. Emmett watched from his place in the line with his arms crossed. He had seen her handle the Winchester. He had a suspicion about what was going to happen, and something warm was spreading through his chest in anticipation of it. The competition was structured in rounds. The early rounds thinned the field. By the time the targets were at 100 yards, 2/3 of the entrants had been eliminated, including the man who had made the comment about women, who went out at 75 yards and left without speaking to anyone. Rebecca had hit every target cleanly, efficiently, with no performance and no wasted motion. She was not doing anything theatrical. She was simply being accurate. By the time it was down to 3 competitors, Rebecca, Emmett, and a cattle hand from the eastern range named Morrison, the crowd had gone from amused to attentive to something that was genuinely riveted. The remaining targets were at 120 yards, and then the final at 150. At 120 yards, Morrison went out. His shot was close, a true cattleman's skill, but the edge of the mark, not the center. At 120 yards, Emmett's shot was dead center. At 120 yards, Rebecca's shot was dead center. The crowd made a sound. The final target was set at 150 yards, which was a genuine test of rifle accuracy, and a distance at which even experienced shooters began to feel the accumulating variables of wind and distance and the simple physical challenge of holding position. Emmett shot first. His round was 3 inches from center, a good shot, a real shot, the kind a skilled lawman might be proud of on any ordinary day. Rebecca settled into her stance. She was very still for a long moment, that stillness that Emmett would come to understand was her reading everything simultaneously. The wind, the light, the distance, adjusting for all of it in a way that was both scientific and instinctive. She drew a breath, released half of it, held. The rifle cracked. The target at 150 yards showed a hole that was, by the measurement of the contest judge who walked out to confirm it, 1 inch from dead center. She had beaten him. The crowd was loud in a way that Caldwell was not usually loud. Children who had been sitting in the grass jumped to their feet. Mrs. Hargrove clapped with genuine enthusiasm. Deputy Tobias let out a whoop that was completely unprofessional and entirely sincere. Emmett stood very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and she was looking back at him, and her expression was braced for something, for wounded pride maybe, for the particular masculine resentment that she had likely encountered before when she had done something better than a man who hadn't expected it. She did not find that on his face. What she found instead was wonder. Genuine, unguarded, immediate wonder. His gray eyes were lit with it, and the smile that broke across his face was the realest thing she had seen on him yet, not the controlled half-smile he used in professional situations, not the measured warmth he offered the town, but something entirely undefended. "Where in the world did you learn to shoot like that?" he said. She blinked. She had not expected that question in that tone. "A woman in Colorado," she said. "She was the best shooter I've ever seen. She taught me the theory behind it, the physics, the mathematics of the shot. She said if you understand why, you never have to rely on weather." Emmett shook his head slowly, still smiling. "The mathematics of the shot," he repeated, as if the phrase delighted him. "That is the most remarkable thing I have heard in years." She felt something then that she was not prepared for. It was not the prize money being pressed into her hand by the contest judge. It was not the congratulations of the crowd, which were genuine and warming in their own way. It was the specific, focused quality of his admiration. Not the patronizing surprise of a man discovering a woman could do something he considered his domain, but the pure, uncomplicated appreciation of one capable person recognizing another who was better at something specific, and finding it wonderful rather than threatening. She had not known a man could look at her that way. She had not known she would feel like that if one did. Later that evening, the celebration had wound down and the town had settled into its Saturday night rhythms, and Rebecca found herself walking along the edge of the main street in the cooling air with Emmett beside her. They were not walking to anywhere in particular. They were simply walking, and neither of them made any move to change that. "You didn't mind," she said eventually. "Mind what?" "Losing." He considered this seriously, which was characteristic of him. "No," he said. "I minded it briefly in the first second, the way you mind anything unexpected. And then I watched you shoot and I understood what I was seeing and I didn't mind it at all." He paused. "I think anyone who minds something like that is missing the point." "Most men miss the point," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry for that, generally speaking." She laughed. It surprised her. It was a real laugh, not the polite social laugh she deployed as needed, but the involuntary kind, the kind that happened before you could decide about it. He heard it and glanced at her sideways, and his expression in the dimming evening light was something she was not going to think too hard about. "What are you going to do," she said, "after this is settled? After Voss? After all of it? After the case is closed and the federal marshal has what he needs and Caldwell goes back to being a quiet town?" She looked ahead. "What then?" He was quiet for a moment. "I've been trying to figure out what makes a place permanent," he said. "What makes somewhere worth staying?" He paused again. "I think it's the people." She heard what he wasn't quite saying and felt it land in the center of her chest. "I've never had a reason to stay anywhere," she said softly. "Have you ever had the chance?" he asked. She didn't answer, because she didn't know how to answer honestly without saying something that felt enormous, and they were not ready for enormous yet. They were still in the careful, fragile stage where every word was a step on ground that might or might not hold. Marshal Beaumont arrived on the 28th of June, quietly on horseback rather than by stage, which was what Emmett had asked for. He was a compact, weathered man of 50 with a reputation for being methodical and for caring about getting things right over getting things fast. Emmett trusted him, which was not a thing Emmett extended easily. Beaumont reviewed everything Rebecca had assembled. He spent 3 hours with it, asking precise questions, and she answered each one with the same clean, well-organized clarity that had been in the original presentation. By the end of it, Beaumont had gone quiet in the particular way of a man who has seen something that satisfies a long-standing itch. "I have been trying to build something on Voss for 4 years, he said. "He's slippery as creek mud and twice as messy when he decides to run." He looked at Rebecca with the direct, uncomplicated respect of a professional recognizing another professional. "Miss Ford, What you've put together here is the most complete pre-warrant assembly of evidence I've seen from a non-attorney in 20 years of federal work." Rebecca accepted this without false modesty and without preening. "Then let's use it," she said. The plan was simple in structure and complicated in execution. On the night of July 1st, after the town's social activities had wound down and the businesses had closed, and Voss would have no particular reason to be watchful, Emmett and Rebecca would ride to the farm property 4 miles east. Beaumont would accompany them. They would retrieve the physical evidence from the storm cellar. Beaumont would secure it under federal chain of custody, and the arrest warrant for Cutter Voss, whose real identity had been legally confirmed through the Wichita land records, would be executed the following morning. The night of July 1st was warm and very dark. The clouds were heavy, covering the moon, which was either fortunate or ominous depending on how you thought about that kind of thing. They rode in near silence. Rebecca knew the property from her father's descriptions and from the map she had drawn, and she navigated with confidence on terrain she had never physically traveled, using landmarks a particular line of cottonwoods, a dry creek bed, the outline of a windmill against the dark sky that her father's letter had described, and that matched what she found. This orientation from description, this ability to build a mental map from words and hold to it in the dark, was something else Emmett noticed about her. She did not hesitate. She was never lost. The farm property was quiet and dark, a modest structure, clearly unused as a residence, with a barn that had begun to lean and a yard gone to weeds. The storm cellar was behind the main building, its door set flush into the earth and covered with boards that were weather-worn but not rotten. Rebecca moved ahead and Emmett moved with her, and Beaumont stayed at the edge of the property with the horses and his hand on his revolver. She knew exactly where to look. The cellar was deeper than it appeared from the entrance, with a second floor that was essentially a root storage level, and in the far corner of that lower level, behind 3 boards that had been nailed in a pattern that looked structural but wasn't, was a tin strongbox. She found it in 4 minutes. Emmett held the lantern while she worked the boards free, and he watched her hands precise, efficient, certain, and felt that by now familiar, breathtaking sensation of watching someone who knew absolutely what they were doing in their particular domain. She had followed her father's letter like a map and had arrived exactly where it said she would, and when she drew the tin box out of the dark corner of that cellar and set it on the dirt floor and opened it, the contents were everything she had said they would be. Documents in Voss's own hand, a ledger connecting him to the robbery, a deed receipt that placed the stolen currency in a location he had full access to, a letter from an accomplice that named Voss directly and described the plan to frame Calvin Ford in terms so explicit it almost read like a boast. "That's it," Rebecca said quietly. Her voice was very controlled, but her hands were resting on the edge of the box, and he could see the smallest tremor in them, not fear, but the release of something she had been holding very tightly for a very long time. "That's all of it." He put his hand over hers without planning to. It was not strategic. It was not considered. It was just the instinct of a man who had been watching someone carry something enormous and who could not stand by in that moment without acknowledging the weight of it. She looked at him in the lantern light. He did not move his hand. Neither did she. "He can rest now," she said softly. She meant her father. Emmett knew it. "Yeah," he said, "he can." They carried the box to Beaumont, who secured it with the seriousness of someone who understood he was holding the resolution of at least 4 federal cases in a tin container. They rode back to Caldwell in the same near silence they had arrived in, but it was a different silence on the return trip, the kind that had something in it rather than the absence of it. The arrest was scheduled for the following morning. What nobody had planned for was Cutter Voss. He was slippery, Beaumont had said. Creek mud and twice as messy when he ran. And somehow, through a contact they had not identified, through some channel they had not accounted for, word reached him. Not the specifics. Not enough to tell him exactly what they had or exactly how it had been assembled. But enough. Enough to make a man who had survived a long time by trusting his instincts do exactly what his instincts told him. Voss walked into the saloon at 4 in the afternoon on July 2nd with two men at his back who had been doing odd jobs around town and whom nobody had thought much about. He had a gun and the kind of specific, dangerous information that people in desperate situations sometimes have. He knew that the sheriff was involved, and he had heard Rebecca's name, and he had made a connection that was wrong in its details but right in its essence. He knew she was connected to Calvin Ford. He did not know how much she had, but he knew she had something. He had decided that the situation called for a hostage. He had not decided on Rebecca specifically. He had decided on whoever was most inconvenient, which brought him to the saloon, where Emmett happened to be at that particular moment talking to the bartender about the town's upcoming harvest social. The gun came up fast and the saloon froze. And that was how Emmett Alden ended up with a gun to his temple. And that was the moment Rebecca Ford walked through the saloon's back door with her Winchester raised, because she had been coming to find Emmett with news from Beaumont, and had heard the noise from the alley and had gone through the back before anyone thought to watch for her from that direction. Because she was not a woman who came in through the front door when the front door was a trap. "You lied to me," she said, and the gun was perfectly steady and the whole room had gone very still. That was the moment Emmett had said, "I withheld. There's a difference." That was the moment she had said, "Not to me there isn't." She had not meant it. She had said it for Voss, to create a fracture, a suggestion of division between herself and the sheriff that might cause Voss to reconsider who was allied with whom, to buy seconds, to create the kind of confusion in a dangerous man's thinking that could mean the difference between a trigger pulled and a trigger held. Emmett understood this at the same moment he heard it. He understood it because he had been paying attention to the way she thought, and he recognized the move, and he played into it. "You want to blame someone, blame yourself for coming here," he said to her, and he put enough irritation in his voice to make it believable, and he shifted his weight just slightly, just enough, as if turning away from her, which was actually a careful repositioning of his center of gravity. Voss's attention divided. That was the critical thing. A man with a gun to a hostage cannot watch two threats simultaneously, not when they seem to be arguing with each other, not when the argument suggests the threat level from one of them might be lower than it appeared. Voss's eyes moved to Rebecca, and in the fraction of a second that his grip changed, not loosened, but changed, Emmett moved. He dropped, clean and fast, straight down, the way you learned to move when a gun was close and you needed it to not be. The shot Voss fired went into the wall above the bar. Emmett came back up with his elbow in Voss's gun arm and his own revolver clearing leather in the same motion. And Voss's two men moved, but Beaumont had come through the front door while everyone was watching the center of the room, and a federal marshal with his badge on his coat and his rifle already raised tends to have a decisive effect on that kind of calculation. It was over in 11 seconds. Voss was on the floor with Emmett's knee on his back and his hands being secured, and his two men were flat against the bar with Beaumont's rifle suggesting this was not a negotiable situation, and the saloon was very loud for a moment and then very quiet. Rebecca lowered her Winchester. Her hands were not shaking. Of course they were not shaking. Emmett looked up at her from where he was kneeling on the floor with Voss secured beneath him, and his gray eyes were bright and his breath was fast, and his expression was something she had never seen on his face before. It was the look of a man who has just been through something genuinely dangerous, and who is fixing his eyes on the particular person who matters most as the first coherent act of returning to safety. "You came through the back," he said. "The front was watched," she said. "You came through the back," he said again, and there was something in it this time that had nothing to do with tactical assessment. She held his gaze. "We can discuss it later." "We will," he said. "We absolutely will." Cutter Voss was taken into federal custody that afternoon. Beaumont processed the arrest with the full weight of 4 federal charges and the physical evidence that had been retrieved from the storm cellar, which was now logged, cataloged, and signed into the official chain of custody in a way that no defense attorney could reasonably challenge. The 2 men who had come in with Voss were held on charges of armed threatening, which Emmett handled locally with the brisk efficiency of a man who has been waiting to do exactly this for a very long time. The town found out over the course of the afternoon and evening. News traveled the way news did in pieces, growing with each retelling, shedding accuracy, and gaining drama at roughly equal rates. By dinner time, the version circulating was that Sheriff Alden and the schoolteacher had jointly dismantled a criminal conspiracy that had been hiding in Caldwell for the better part of a year. By the following morning, this version was essentially correct, which was unusual for small-town news. Voss's real identity, Thomas Carver's mask coming completely off, caused the kind of community shock that comes when someone you trusted turns out to have been a construction rather than a person. The town council members who had been friendly to him were embarrassed and defensive and quick to explain themselves, which Emmett handled with the patience of a man who understood that people made mistakes about other people, and that this was not in itself a crime. The cattle operation owner, who had genuinely liked what he thought was Carver, came to Emmett with information about their business dealings that turned out to provide 2 additional pieces of evidence in Beaumont's case. He gave it freely and without prompting, which was a decent thing, and Emmett told him so. Rebecca spent the day of July 3rd at the schoolhouse because it was a teaching day and the children had nothing to do with any of the events of the previous weeks and deserved a normal day regardless. This was typical of her, the ability to compartmentalize, to understand which obligation was due when, to show up completely for whatever the present moment required. Emmett came to the schoolhouse in the late afternoon when the children had been dismissed and found her at the front of the room, erasing the day's arithmetic lesson from the slate board. The last light of the afternoon came through the single west-facing window and caught her in that particular gold that the Kansas plains did in late afternoon, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. "It's done," he said. She set down the eraser and turned. "Beaumont's report, filed and sent to Topeka. The evidence goes with him when he rides out on Friday. The charges against your father will be formally reviewed through the federal process. Beaumont says it will be a few months, but the outcome is certain given what we've submitted." He paused. "His record will be corrected." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. She turned back to the board, but she was not seeing it. "He'll know," she said, almost to herself. "Wherever he is, he'll know." "I think he'd be prouder of you than he'd be relieved about himself," Emmett said. She turned to look at him, and something in her face was open in a way it had not been before, not unguarded entirely, but the particular quality of guardedness she carried, the watchfulness, the readiness, was quieter than it had been, as if the thing she'd been braced for had finally arrived and passed, and she could ease the weight of preparing for it. "I've been thinking," she said. "So have I, about what I do now," she said. "I came here with a purpose, and the purpose is accomplished, and the practical question is, stay," he said. She stopped. "I know that's not a question," he said. "I know I don't have any formal right to ask it, and I know you've made your own decisions for your entire adult life, and you don't need anyone telling you what to do with what comes next." He moved into the room, away from the doorway, and stood near one of the children's desks with his hat in his hands, and he was as unguarded as she had ever seen him. "But I am asking. Not as the sheriff who gave you one night and meant something different by it than I understood at the time. I'm asking as myself, as Emmett." He paused. "Stay." She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was dimming around them and the schoolroom was very quiet. "The school board has asked me if I'll continue through the fall term," she said finally. "I know, Hargrove told me. I may have encouraged him to ask." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "That's close to maneuvering." "It is absolutely maneuvering," he agreed. "I'm not proud of it." I'm asking you to stay, and I used every legitimate angle available to give you a reason that wasn't about me, because I didn't know if you'd want it to be about me. And it turns out I'm not as good at not caring about things as I've been leading people to believe." "What things?" she said quietly. "You," he said simply. "I care about you considerably more than is professionally reasonable, and I've been failing to not care for about 3 weeks now, and I've decided it's better to be honest about it than to pretend." She crossed the room to him, which surprised him. She moved directly, without hesitation, which was characteristic of her in everything, and which he should have expected and was somehow not prepared for. She stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his eyes, and for a moment they were both very still. "I'm not good at staying," she said. "I should tell you that honestly. I've never done it. I don't have any evidence that I know how." "Neither do I," he said. "But I think we're both fairly good at figuring out things we haven't done before." That made her breath catch. He heard it, that small involuntary sound, and she almost smiled. And the almost smile broke open into the real one, the actual one, the one she had shown him only a handful of times, but that transformed her face into something that stopped his heart briefly every time. "One night," she said. "You said one night." "And I meant a lifetime," he said. "I didn't know it at the time. But I did." He kissed her then in the late afternoon light of the Caldwell schoolhouse, which was not the most orthodox setting for the beginning of something that had actually been beginning for 3 weeks across a jailhouse desk and a shooting contest and a storm cellar in the dark, but which felt, to both of them, exactly right. She kissed him back, which was its own kind of answer, the definitive kind. She accepted the school board's contract for the full fall term, and then, in October, when the board asked if she would consider the following year as well, she accepted that too. By November it was understood, without either of them having made a formal announcement to the effect, that Rebecca Ford was in Caldwell for considerably longer than any of them had originally supposed. The formal correctness of the situation: she was living at the boarding house run by a practical widow named Mrs. Cates, and Emmett was at his own quarters adjacent to the jailhouse, was important to them both, because they were building something that they wanted to be right, and doing it right meant doing it carefully, which was consistent with the characters of both of them. They courted, is what they did, in the particular way of two people who are capable of impulse but who choose to proceed with intention. They had Sunday dinners together, with other people sometimes and sometimes not. They took evening walks that had gradually become a habit in the town's understanding, a predictable, familiar sight that the town approved of, partly because they liked Rebecca and liked Emmett, and partly because a sheriff with a reason to be happy is, in general, better for everybody. He told her one evening in September about the specifics of what had gone wrong in Abilene, the full story, not the edited version he had given her before. A deputy who had been taking money from the wrong people, Emmett's trust in him, which had been based on real affection and had been genuine and had been used against him. A family threatened because of a warning Emmett had failed to take seriously. Everyone had survived, but it had been close, and the distance between fine and catastrophic had been narrow enough that Emmett had never fully forgiven himself for not seeing what had been in front of him. Rebecca listened to all of it. She did not rush to reassure him or to argue him out of his own assessment of his mistakes. She let him lay it out fully, and then she said, "You trusted someone who didn't deserve it. That's a failure of the other person's character, not yours. I should have seen it. People who don't have dark motives sometimes can't see dark motives in others," she said. "You were raised by honest people. I was raised around people who hid things constantly, and I learned to read for it early. That's not virtue on my part, it's circumstance. You shouldn't blame yourself for having been trusting when trust was reasonable." He was quiet for a while. "You're very sure about that," he said. "I'm sure that blaming yourself for another person's betrayal is a way of making yourself responsible for everything, which sounds like control but is actually a cage." He looked at her. "When did you become wise?" "I was always wise," she said, perfectly seriously. "I've just been waiting for you to notice." He laughed a real laugh, the kind she collected from him because they were still rarer than she thought they should be, and reached across the table to take her hand, and she let him. He asked her to marry him in October, on an evening in the early fall when the Kansas sky was the particular shade of deep blue that only exists for about 20 minutes on clear October evenings, just after the last of the color has gone from the horizon. They were on the edge of town, the horses hitched to a fence post, the wide plain spread out in front of them. He had not prepared a speech. He was not a speech kind of man, and she was not a speech kind of woman, and they both knew that what existed between them did not need elaborate framing. "I want to build something permanent with you," he said. "I want it to be a real life here with real things in it. I want to be the kind of man you deserve to come home to." He paused. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment in the evening light. The wind moved through the grass of the plain below them. "Yes," she said, "I will." They were married in November, in the church on the west side of Caldwell's Main Street, by the minister who had been serving the town for 6 years and who performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity and genuine feeling for two people he had watched falling in love across his town all summer. The church was full. Hargrove sat in the front row with his children. Deputy Tobias stood up with Emmett, and Tobias cried, which he did not try very hard to hide. Mrs. Hargrove had organized the church flowers. Mrs. Cates had organized the wedding dinner at the boarding house, which was the largest meal the building had ever produced, and which went on for 4 hours and was remembered fondly in Caldwell for years. Marshal Beaumont had come back from Topeka for it, which surprised and moved them both. He had been there for the worst of what had brought them together, and it seemed right that he should be there for the best of what came from it. He gave a toast at the dinner table that was brief and honest, and caused Rebecca to blink several times rapidly, which was as close to tears in public as she ever came. "She rebuilt something that looked completely lost," Beaumont said, "and she did it without a legal credential, without institutional support, and without anyone's permission. And he had the good sense to see it for what it was. I've been in this work 30 years, and I have never met two people more exactly suited to stand beside each other than these two right here." Rebecca squeezed Emmett's hand under the table. He squeezed back. They moved into a house that Emmett had quietly purchased in September. A 2-story frame house on the north side of Caldwell's Main Street, solid and well-built, with a kitchen large enough for a real table and a parlor that faced east and caught the morning light. Rebecca had put her particular stamp on it immediately, organizing the household with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything, adding bookshelves that were full within a month, hanging a long map of the territories on the study wall with pins marking points of interest that she updated regularly, because she found the geography of the region genuinely compelling. She continued teaching. This was never in question. The school board was so grateful to have her that they would have given her essentially any terms she asked for, and she asked for fair terms and got them, and the school in Caldwell became something the town was genuinely proud of. Test results improved. Attendance improved. 3 children who had been considered unable to learn showed, under her instruction, that what they had was not inability but the wrong approach. And watching those children discover their own competence was, Rebecca said privately to Emmett, the most satisfying work she had ever done. He had his own ongoing work, which was the more complex, less celebrated work of keeping a growing frontier town safe in a period when the frontier was still sorting itself out. The cattle trade brought money and money brought people, and not all of them were the kind you wanted. But Emmett had a gift for the work, a combination of physical authority, careful judgment, and a genuine interest in understanding what drove people to the choices they made, and Caldwell's crime rate over the following years was notably lower than comparable towns. He hired a second deputy in 1883, a young Mexican man named Ramirez who was sharp and honest, and who had been doing odd jobs around town while quietly wanting something more. Emmett had noticed him, and offered him the position over the skepticism of certain town council members who raised concerns that Emmett addressed with a directness that settled the matter. Ramirez turned out to be an exceptional deputy and later became a sheriff in his own right, which Emmett considered one of the better outcomes of anything he had done in Caldwell. In January of 1884, Rebecca told Emmett she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with the same directness she brought to everything. He was drinking coffee at the table and she sat down across from him and said, "I have something to tell you." He put down his coffee. She told him. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she had never seen before on his face. It was too large to be a single thing. It was love and fear and wonder all at once, and his eyes went bright in a way that made her throat tight. He came around the table and crouched in front of her and took both her hands and held them with a gentleness that was completely different from the way he held anything else, and he pressed his forehead to her hands. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I'm going to stay perfectly well. I'm healthy and capable, and I have already located the best physician available in the region, who is a woman in Wichita who trained in St. Louis and who has excellent results." She paused. "I've thought about it thoroughly." "Of course you have," he said against her hands, and she could feel him smiling. "I thought you should know," she said, "that I'm not frightened." He looked up at her. "Are you?" "A little," she admitted, "but the right kind, the kind that means it matters." "The kind that means it matters," he repeated. He stood and pulled her to him, and she rested her head against his shoulder, which was still, every time, something that surprised her by how much she wanted it. "We're going to be completely fine," he said. "I know," she said. Their son was born in September of 1884, and they named him Calvin James Alden, Calvin for her father, James for Emmett's father. He was a healthy, loud, fiercely certain person from his first hour, and the entire town of Caldwell had an opinion about him immediately, which was consistent with how the town felt about his parents. Emmett held him in the first hour, in the bedroom of the frame house on the north side of the street, while the doctor from Wichita finished what needed finishing, and Rebecca rested with her eyes half closed and watching him hold their son. And the expression on Emmett's face was something she put away in the deepest part of her memory, to have permanently, the way you keep certain things. He looked down at this new person in his arms, this loud, certain, red-faced declaration of everything they had built, and then he looked at Rebecca, and his voice when he spoke was entirely unsteady for the first time she had ever heard it. "He's extraordinary," he said. "He is," she agreed. "You are," Emmett said. "I need you to know I understand completely what this cost you, and I am so—" "Emmett," she said gently. "Yes. Come sit beside me." He sat beside her on the edge of the bed with Calvin between them, and outside the window September was doing what September did in Kansas, which was burning a slow gold that would take several weeks to give way to the cold, and the town was quiet in the particular way of late afternoon, and for a long time neither of them spoke. The federal case had been formally concluded the previous spring. The review of Calvin Ford's record had been completed, and the federal court in Topeka had issued a formal correction to his file, acknowledging that the currency charges had been fraudulently manufactured through Voss's conspiracy. This did not undo the genuine crimes of Calvin's life or the sentence he had served for them, and it did not bring him back, and Rebecca had been honest with herself and with Emmett about the complexity of that, about grieving a complicated man in a complicated way. But there was something in the formal record being set right that had mattered, a truth restored, an injustice named. She had carried the project of it for 3 years, and it was done, and what she had on the other side of it was this house and this man and now this son, which was not something she had planned for and which was, she had decided, the best kind of unplanned. Cutter Voss had been convicted on all 4 federal charges in early 1883 and sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. He was serving that sentence in Leavenworth, which was the same prison where Calvin Ford had died, and Rebecca had decided, after thinking about it carefully, that she did not intend to waste any part of her attention on what Voss thought or felt about any of this. He had made his choices, and the world had made its response, and the matter was settled, and she had better things to do with her attention. The year Calvin turned 2, Rebecca expanded the school curriculum to include a half-day for adult learning twice a week, reading and arithmetic for adults in the community who had never had the opportunity when they were young. This was her own initiative, brought to the school board with a detailed proposal that included cost projections and projected outcomes, and a case that was essentially impossible to argue with, which was typical of her proposals. The board approved it unanimously. The sessions quickly drew 15 regular attendees, including several of the Mexican farm-working families who lived south of town, 2 Chinese men who had come to the territory with the railroad and stayed, and an older Osage man named White River who came to the morning sessions, and with whom Rebecca developed a mutual respect grounded in the fact that they both moved through the world with a clear-eyed assessment of what it was, and a refusal to pretend otherwise. White River brought her dried herbs once, after she had mentioned that Calvin had a persistent cough through the winter, and explained which ones to use and how. She tried them with care and they helped, and she asked him about the knowledge behind them, and this began a series of conversations that went on for years and that she considered among the most educationally valuable of her life. "You are a person who understands that learning has no single source," White River told her once, which she received as the compliment it was. Emmett watched his wife navigate the world with a sustained, daily admiration that he occasionally worried was excessive, and then decided was not. She was, he had concluded within the first year of their marriage, someone who became more extraordinary the better you knew her, which was the opposite of how most people worked, and which meant that loving her was an ongoing process of discovery rather than a fixed state. He found this endlessly interesting. He told her so once, and she had looked at him with that expression she wore when something moved her that she had not expected to be moved by. "You are a remarkable man, Emmett Alden," she said. "I had good material to work with," he said, meaning the years and the case and everything in it, meaning her. She understood him, which was perhaps the best thing about the whole arrangement. In the summer of 1886, their daughter arrived. They named her Me Helen Alden, Helen for Emmett's mother, Me for the month she'd been conceived, which was Rebecca's quiet joke that Emmett appreciated, and that would not be explained to the children until they were considerably older. Me was, from the beginning, a quieter presence than her brother, but no less determined, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's capacity for absolute stillness at moments of concentrated attention. By the time she was 3, she was following Rebecca around the schoolhouse with a proprietary interest, and by the time she was 5, she was assisting in ways that were actually useful. Calvin, by contrast, had inherited his grandfather's name and his father's physical certainty, and was loud and sure of himself and deeply affectionate, and was already, at 4 years old, in the habit of marching into the jailhouse to visit his father at work with the ease of someone who understood they were welcome everywhere. Tobias, now Deputy Tobias of 4 years standing and no longer quite so young, though still capable of unchecked enthusiasm at key moments, considered himself an unofficial uncle to both children and took this role with more seriousness than he brought to several of his professional duties, which Emmett accepted because the trade-off was worth it. On an evening in August of 1887, 5 years after the last stage west had rolled into Caldwell with Rebecca Ford on it, Emmett and Rebecca sat on the front porch of their house in the evening light while the children slept upstairs, and the town settled into its nighttime rhythms around them. It was warm and clear, and the stars over the Kansas plain were extraordinary in the way they were when there was no moon to compete with them. They were sitting close together, her hand in his, in the comfortable proximity of people who have been close for years and have never needed the closeness to be performed. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" she asked, not with drama, just curious. "One night," he said. "I told you you had one night. And what did you mean by it?" I meant professionally. I meant give me one night to assess what you have and we'll see what happens after." He paused. "But I think part of me knew, the way you sometimes know things that you're not ready to admit to yourself yet, that whatever was going to come after one night was going to be considerably more than I'd said." "You couldn't have known that," she said. "I couldn't have known it consciously," he agreed. "But you stepped off that stage and I looked at you and something shifted. The kind of shift that doesn't shift back." He turned his head to look at her. "I think I meant a lifetime the moment I said it. I just didn't have language for it yet." She looked at him across the evening in the starlight, with the sounds of their sleeping children above them and their town around them and everything they had built between them in 5 years laid out like a landscape behind and ahead. "I came here to finish something," she said. "To close something. I never expected—" She stopped, and the break in her voice was so small as to be almost imperceptible, but he heard it. "I know," he said softly. "I never expected to find something that had nothing to do with the past." She laced her fingers more firmly through his. "Something entirely its own. Did you mind?" She turned to look at him fully, and in the starlight her face was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, which was not a rational thing and not something he could have explained to anyone, but which was simply the truth that lived in him without question. "I mind nothing," she said, "about any of it, not one single moment." He brought her hand to his lips and held it there for a moment, and neither of them needed to say anything else, because the whole of it was already said, in the years of it, in the house behind them, in the sleeping children, in the town that had become theirs, in the space between them that had started as professional calculation and became something as permanent as the land itself. The morning after, Rebecca was at the schoolhouse before the children arrived, putting the day's lessons on the board. The arithmetic first, then the spelling words, then the geography questions she had been developing around the territories, practical, current, connected to the world the children would actually inhabit. She believed in practical knowledge. She believed in giving children the tools to think, not just the answers. The first child through the door that morning was a girl named Clara, who was 8 years old and who had, over the past 2 years, developed a passion for arithmetic that Rebecca was actively cultivating. Clara set her lunch pail under her desk and looked at the board with the focused intensity of someone spotting something they had been waiting for. "Mrs. Alden," she said, "is question 3 a trick question?" Rebecca looked at the board. "It's a question that requires more than one step," she said. "Whether that's a trick depends on how you approach it." Clara studied it for another moment. "I think I see it," she said. "Show me at the end of the lesson," Rebecca said. She would, and she would be right. And Rebecca would feel the particular quiet joy of watching a young mind arrive exactly where it was capable of arriving when given the right tools and the right expectation. This was the life. The specific texture of it, built out of 10,000 ordinary moments and a handful of extraordinary ones, out of a forensic case assembled in 6 months of methodical work, and a shooting contest on a Saturday afternoon, and a storm cellar in the dark, and a jailhouse desk in lamplight, and a wedding in November, and 2 children asleep upstairs on an August evening. Out of a man who had looked at her and seen her, all of her, the capability and the complexity and the dark past and the fierce independence, and had not wanted to change any of it. Out of a woman who had arrived somewhere intending only to pass through and had found, to her genuine and permanent astonishment, that she was home. Emmett came by the schoolhouse at noon, as he sometimes did when the morning was quiet enough, bringing 2 wrapped biscuits from the bakery that had opened the previous year on the east end of the main street. Rebecca met him at the door and they stood in the doorway together in the midday sun while the children ate their lunches in the schoolyard behind her. "Clara solved question 3, Rebecca told him. "In what way?" "The way it was meant to be solved. She saw the second step without being told to look for it." She glanced back at the schoolyard, where Clara was explaining something to 2 other children with the animated authority of someone who has recently understood something and wants everyone else to understand it too. Emmett watched the scene with a quiet smile. "She'll be running something someday," he said. "She'll be running everything someday," Rebecca said, with the easy confidence of someone who had already made up her mind about it. He handed her one of the biscuits. She took it without fuss and leaned against the doorframe, and they stood together in the noon sun of a day in August 1887 and looked at the town around them, the street that was theirs, the people who were theirs, the ordinary and extraordinary life that had been built from a single night that had meant something else entirely. "Emmett," she said. "Yeah, I'm glad the stage was late." He looked at her, puzzled. "The stage the day you arrived. It was 40 minutes late. If it had been on time, you might have left the depot before it arrived. You were there because Harding's wire said I was coming, but if you had stood there for an hour in that heat with no stage—" "I would have stayed," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I was waiting for something important," he said. "I wouldn't have left." She looked at him for a moment. Then quietly, simply, she said, "Neither would I." He held out his hand and she took it, standing in the doorway of the Caldwell schoolhouse in the August sun. And the children played in the yard behind her, and the town moved around them, and the Kansas plain stretched out beyond in every direction, vast and clear and full of everything that was possible. It was not a perfect life. Nothing was perfect. There were hard winters and difficult seasons and conflicts in the town that required more patience than either of them sometimes had. There were days when the weight of the past made itself felt, hers and his, the dark things they had each carried and set down slowly rather than all at once. There were arguments because they were both too certain and too capable not to argue, and the arguments were thorough and fair, and usually ended with some combination of one of them being right, and both of them learning something, which was better than most alternatives. But the life was real, which was something else entirely from perfect and worth considerably more. It was theirs, built piece by piece from a stranger's arrival on a late stage west, and a sheriff's offer of one night, and a woman who had stood in a saloon with a gun to the man she loved's head and not flinched, who had walked into a storm cellar in the dark following her dead father's map, who had stood at 150 yards and understood the mathematics of a shot in a way that had made a man look at her with pure, unguarded wonder and never quite stop looking. She kept teaching. He kept the law. The children grew. The town grew. The life accumulated around them in layers, season by season, as permanent as anything the frontier had ever produced and more alive than most of it. They had one more child, a second son, in 1889, whom they named Thomas, not for Voss's alias, which had briefly made the name feel complicated, but for Rebecca's maternal grandfather, who had been a farmer in Ohio, and whom she had known only through her father's stories. Thomas was, from the beginning, the most serene of the three children, which his older siblings treated as a personal challenge. Calvin and me and Thomas Alden grew up in a house full of books and maps and honest conversation, raised by a mother who assumed their intelligence, and a father who demonstrated that strength and gentleness were not in opposition, and who were told the full truth about where they had come from, the complicated, costly, ultimately love-built truth of it, when they were old enough to hold it. In 1892, 10 years after the last stage west had rolled into Caldwell, the town held a civic celebration of its 20-year founding anniversary. There were speeches and a long dinner and a dance in the main street under lanterns that swayed in the September evening breeze. Emmett and Rebecca danced, which they did not do often and were not particularly accomplished at, and which they found funny enough in their own ineptitude to enjoy considerably. Calvin, at 8 years old, had his mother's seriousness and his father's physical presence, and was already practicing his shooting in the yard behind the house, with a patience that had come from somewhere in the combination of them. Me, at 6, had discovered that she preferred books to almost everything else, and was currently reading at a level that regularly surprised adults who had not been paying sufficient attention, which her mother found entirely appropriate. Thomas, at 3, was primarily interested in the dog that Deputy Ramirez had brought to the celebration, a large patient hound named Justice, which was a very serious name for a dog, and which Thomas had immediately shortened to Zeus, which was not a name so much as a sound, but the dog responded to it so. Emmett stood at the edge of the dancing and watched his family in the lantern light. Rebecca was talking to White River, who had come to the celebration, and who was explaining something with the particular deliberateness of a man making sure he is being understood. She was listening with her full attention, which was something she gave completely when she gave it at all, and her expression was the one she wore when she was genuinely engaged, focused, interested, fully present. He had been looking at her for 10 years now. He had no plan to stop. She glanced up and found him watching, and the slight lift at the corner of her mouth that was her specific version of a smile. The real one, not the public one, crossed her face, and she looked back at White River, and he knew she was smiling fully now because she was slightly turned away. He walked over to her. He stood beside her. White River finished what he was saying, and Rebecca translated the relevant parts for Emmett's benefit, which she had gotten into the habit of doing because she found his genuine interest in the exchange valuable and because it was the kind of partnership that made both of them better. When the music started again, he offered her his hand. She looked at it. "We are terrible at this," she reminded him. "Absolutely," he agreed. "Come on." She took his hand. They danced badly and with considerable amusement, and the children watched from the side with varying degrees of judgment, and the lantern swayed above the main street of Caldwell, and the September air was cool and full of the smell of the plains, and the stars were beginning to come out over the Kansas dark, and the life they had built around that single offered night went on, permanent and particular and theirs, into everything that came after.